Thank you so much for coming to my session. My name is Alba Rivas. I am a lead developer evangelist at Salesforce. Yeah, I joined recently, really 2 months ago. And this is my email and my Twitter username in case that you want to follow me. This is the forward-looking statement slide. This just means that Salesforce is a publicly traded company and you should make your buying decisions based on the products that are commercially available. And let's start with the session. So what I want you to take out from this session is how easy and how great it is to migrate from Aura to Lightning Web Components. For that, I wanted to use a practical example. So I picked the Greenhouse app. I don't know if you know this app already. This is an application, a sample app that my team wrote some years ago. It's written in Aura, and it's written in LWC as well. And it's in our sample app galleries repository. And from this app, I picked a page, which is a page in which you can look for properties in a real estate sample app. This page was really built by 3 components. We have the filters on the left-hand side in which you can add some filter criteria to look for properties in the backend. Then we have the property type list, which is the panel in which we are going to show those properties. And we are going to use an individual component to represent its property, which is called property tile. So first thing that you need to do if you are going to start working with Lightning Web Components is to download Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is the IDE recommended by Salesforce. We have released a couple of extensions. Well, it's only one, really, but it has a lot of functionality called Salesforce Extensions for Visual Studio Code. And that's going to give you auto-completion capabilities. It's going to show you the help of the base components when you hover over them, and a lot of more functionality. Then, to be able to upload your Lightning Web Components to the organization, what you need to do is to use either the Salesforce CLI or the Ant tooling. The developer console does not show Lightning Web Components, and you cannot use it for develop Lightning Web Components. And the third thing I recommend you to do is to set up your debugging configuration. I'm not going in depth in how to do that in this presentation, but here you have a really nice blog written by René from my team, which explains that very well. So when you are going to migrate an application, first thing that you need to do is to define iterations. It's better to do things step by step so that you can check in each step that you have migrated is working, that doing everything at the same time. So the first thing that we are going to try to migrate is the property tile component, which was the simplest one. So first, I'm going to show you what we expect from this step. This is very simple. We just expect to have a component that is able to show a fake property. So this was the code in Aura. And this is the code in Lightning Web Components. And we have to highlight several things. So first thing, we have to migrate Aura components to templates. Because in Lightning Web Components, we are following the HTML templates standard, which is part of the Web Components specification. Then we can copy the HTML code directly. That's straightforward, it's the same. And if we were using references to other components, as for example, base components, the only thing that's going to change is the syntax. So before we had, for example, lining formatted number with the colon and the camel case, and that's going to be now kebab case. Did you know that kebab case is the name for this syntax? And the same for the attributes, okay? What else do we have here? We had properties, because we were representing a property via an attribute that was, we had attributes, okay? We were representing a property which was a JavaScript object via an attribute. And we were able to reference those attributes in our markup using exclamation mark, v, dot, and the name of the attribute. So attributes become properties. we don't define attributes anymore in the markup. We define them in the JavaScript file. For now, I've created a fake property. We don't worry yet about anything else. And we are able to reference that property, with a different syntax, because now we are not going to need the exclamation mark v dot, but we can use it directly. And the other thing that we had to change in this component is that in our components, we were able to compute markup, to compute something in the markup using markup expressions. So we were able to compute that CSS styling. And now that's not available anymore because we decided that that was a bad practice, as logic should be in the controller and never in the markup. So to replace that, what you need to do is to create a getter, compute that property in the getter, and reference the getter in your markup. And that's it. Then this component had a CSS file. Fortunately, migrating a CSS file is really straightforward because the only thing that we have to do is to remove the this keyword. The this keyword is not needed anymore because in Lightning Web Components we are using Shadow DOM, we are following the Shadow DOM specification, and the CSS is going to be scoped to the component by default. Great, we have our property type component. Let's do another iteration. Let's migrate the property type list component. So now, what we want to have, again, I'm going to use fake properties. I'm not getting anything from the backend yet. And I'm going to have the property type list component, which is the panel, which is the one in which now I'm going to define the two fake properties that at the end I will retrieve from the backend. And I'm going to iterate over the property type to represent each individual component, each individual property. Okay, so this was the code for the property type list component. As you can see now, we have to define a properties attribute there, or we had that in Aura. And now we said that attributes become properties. The properties, forgive the repetition. For now, it's going to have two fake accounts because I just want to show those accounts in my markup to see that everything works correctly. And one thing to take a look at is how do we perform the Aura iteration. So in Aura, there was a component called Aura iteration that you could use, and then you could reference the component inside the iteration so that it shows as many properties as we have in our attribute. And now we have to replace that by a for each template. It's very similar. Again, the only thing that changes here is the camel case syntax to the kebab case syntax. And now we are passing the property from the parent to the child, doing that binding. That means that in the child, I can't have a fake property anymore, but what I need to create is an API property. What's this API? API is a decorator. Decorators are not exclusive from JavaScript. So for example, we have decorators in Python. And this is just a way to add functionality to an entity that may be function, for example, but in this case, we are adding some functionality to a property. So what we are using this decorator for is to specify that this property must be set by a parent component, and it should never be changed inside the component itself. Okay, so the other thing that we had to migrate about this component is how to make the page available for a builder. In Aura, we had to implement the flexi page available for all page types interface. And now what we need to use is to specify that in the metadata file. The good news is that now we have much more configuration options because we can, for example, say that a page is going to be available for record pages, but only for accounts and opportunities. I recommend you to take a look because it's much better now. Okay, so we migrated our property tile and our property tile list. Let's migrate the filters. This is a tough one. Sorry. Okay. Now. Okay, so now what we want to have is a component here that is able to get some input from the user, whatever, here. And for now, we are not going to do anything of this input. The only thing that we want to implement is the behavior of getting that input and the behavior of resetting the component. So one thing that we need to know when migrating this kind of components is how to migrate facets. So facets were a kind of attribute that we could define in Aura that could receive any arbitrary HTML from the parent so that it's placed in a specific area of the component. So for example, the lightning card-based component has several facets, but we were using one in the Aura implementation of this component, which is the actions facet. In this facet, we were placing a lightning button in this way, doing an Aura set, whatever, whatever. So the way to migrate this facet is very simple because the only thing that we have to do is everything that you want to be placed in the facet, add a slot attribute, and then followed by the name of the facet. So this is very simple and is much more standard. That's the reason we change, because this is a standard HTML. Okay, so we said that in this component, we want to get some user input. For that, we are going to use lightning input and lightning slider. These components internally are rendering an HTML input, and these components are in charge of getting the input that the user is writing and passing that up to my component, which is property filters. So that's important to understand because this has changed in Lightning Web Components, and I think is when you understand this, you are going to understand how the full framework works. So this is how Aura worked. So we had a child component, which is the Lightning input. We had a parent component, which is the property filters component. And you could do bidirectional data binding. This is, you could define a property in the parent and a property in the child and bind them bidirectionally so that the parent could change the value of the child property and the child could change the value of the parent property. So if I wanted my Lightning input to send me information about what the user is entering, it could do it via bidirectional data binding. So the way to do this in Aura was, okay, at any point, as I'm binding the search key, for example, to the value of the input, at any point, I can just check which is the value of that search key property because it's bound bidirectionally and the child is sending that information up. However, that has changed in Lightning Web Components. This is because of performance and it's much more standard now as well. So now if you want to pass data down, you can do it via properties as we did with the API property when I iterate over our property tile component. But if you want to pass information up, you need to do it via events. So the child component has to fire an event, and we have to listen to that event and get the information from the payload of the event. So that's what we are doing in Lightning Web Components. We listen to the on-change event that the child component, in this case the Lightning input or the Lightning slider, are firing, and we get the search key, number of bedrooms, and number of bathrooms that the user is entering in those HTML inputs from the event detail property. And then we can store that in private properties or do whatever we want with that, okay? As I say, this is really key to understand. So there's one thing missing from this step, because I said I wanted to migrate also the reset button behavior. The component that is going to be in charge of implementing that behavior is the parent component. So what we need to do this time is pass information down, because what we want to do is to, on reset, set a 0 value to those properties. And we were able to do that in Aura, and we are able to do that in Lightning Web Components, because we said that passing information down is done in the same way. So it's exactly the same, okay? One thing that we need to take into account. So in Aura, if you change a value of an attribute, the full component was re-rendered. In Lightning Web Components, for performance, it's not like that. It's something that you control. And if you want the components to re-render when a property value changes, you have to add this annotation, track. As I'm changing the value of those properties programmatically, if I want those components to effectively show that the slider has been reset to 0 and that my input field has been emptied, I have to use the track property. Track decorator, sorry. That again is a decorator that you can import from the Lightning Web Components library, and that the framework is going to handle its behavior. Okay, so we finish this step. Next step is to, instead of using 2 fake properties, let's call the backend, let's call Apex, and let's bring those properties from there. So what we expect to have in this case, you can see a difference, because in this step, in the previous one, I had only 2 properties which were hard-coded in the JavaScript file. And now we are bringing all the properties. We are not filtering by anything yet, because we don't have that information from the filters component, but we are able to retrieve all the properties from the backend. Okay, so in Aura, we were using an Apex controller. In Apex controller, we had a method defined to which we could pass the search key and the number of bedrooms and bathrooms, and we were doing a query in the database and returning that. This method was Aura-enabled. This was a requirement from Aura components. And then in our controller file or in our helper file, we were calling that Apex method as an action and doing something with the result. Okay, so the only thing that we have to change in Apex is to add the cacheable attribute to the Aura-enabled annotation. This is if we are going to read data, okay? If we are not reading data, obviously it's not something that's cacheable, and we need another way to invoke Apex. So why do we do this? Because adding this attribute allows me to use the wire service. The wire service is a service that we have created that is going to allow you to declaratively get data and modify data from the backend in a very intelligent way. For example, if we are reading data with the wire service and the Lightning data service, that data is going to be stored in a cache in the client, and we are going to avoid repetitive calls to the backend. So if the data is there, my JavaScript controller is not going to call the backend. It's going to get it from there. And a lot of more capabilities, as for example, synchronization, progressive load, a grouping of requests, a lot of functionality. The way that we have to use the wire service in Lightning Web Components is another decorator called wire. So what we do is we import the Apex method that we want to use, and then we use the wire decorator. The wire decorator receives 2 parameters. First one is the method that we want to call. In this case, I'm calling an Apex method, but there are also some standard wire adapters that we have released to get record data directly, okay? And for example, there is a beta wire adapter called Let's Get List UI that I could have used in this example probably, okay? But I just migrated from Aura, so I didn't. So the first parameter is the Apex method. Second parameter is the attributes that I want to pass to my Apex call. And with that decorator, I'm going to decorate a property or a function. So what's going to happen here is that each time that I change one of the parameters, the search key or the number of bedrooms or bathrooms, the Apex method is going to be executed in a smart way. So this Apex method will bring the data either from the cache or from the server, and is going to store that data into my properties property. Okay, so the next thing to do is to communicate the component in the left with the component in the right. They are not part of the same DOM hierarchy. So before, what we were doing was using an application event. So before, for example, if I come here, which is the final result, and I was filtering, this has happened because I'm sending an application event, and the component on the right-hand side is listening to that event. How do we replace that in Lightning Web Components? Well, this is the Aura code. If you don't remember, this was an application event. This was the way to register the event in a component that is going to fire it. This was the way to fire the event. This was the way to register a handler for the event. And this was the way to say, when I listen to that event, I'm going to do something. In our case, we need to connect that with the call to Apex, right? So now what do we have? The Lightning Message Service. This is developer preview in Winter 20, so it's fairly new. You can already get your hands on with it with any developer org that has Winter 20 already on it. And the Lightning Message Service is using a new metadata type called Lightning Message, which is similar to the application event because there we can define fields that are going to define the payload of the event, what the event is going to carry when it's fired. And this message channel is message service, no, it's message channel, sorry. This message channel is going to be shared by components that are in different DOM hierarchies, but not only by Lightning Web Components, but also Aura components and Visualforce components. So for example, you can have a piece of Visualforce in a page and Lightning Web Components in the same page, and you can communicate those using the Lightning Message Service, which is really cool. And here I leave you a link with the release notes, just in case that you want to take a look. So this would be the way to use the Lightning Message Service. So I created the channel I mentioned before, property filters. So you have to import that channel. You have to import some functions from the Lightning Message Service library, and you have to use those functions to publish the event. In this case, we are going to publish an event that carries the search key, number of bedrooms, and number of bathrooms that the user has specified each time that I change something in any of these three filters. And how to subscribe to a Lightning message. So again, we have to subscribe to the channel. We have to import some functions and just subscribe to the channel and define which is going to be the handler for that message, for when that message is listened. And here, I wanted to show you the full class because I think it's going to be interesting. Can you see that? Probably not. Okay, so this is the subscription. So here what we do is when the message is listened in the right-hand side component, the property tile list, we are going to fire the handle filter change handler. Here we are going to store what's coming from the event in the search key number bedrooms and number bathrooms properties. And what's happening here? That with that dollar symbol, I'm making the wire service to bring new data each time the value of any of those properties changes. So I've connected the Lightning message service with the wire service, and now my code is much more cleaner, much cleaner than before, and it's much easier to maintain it. Isn't it easy? Okay, so last thing that I wanted to show you, this is a benchmark that we have run over the Dreamhouse app in Lightning, written with Lightning Web Components and written with Aura. There is a blog post that explains how we have performed the benchmarks. And these are the improvements on the page load time, the EPT, which you can see that are great, especially when we do the warm test, which is when you have load the page already several times, because there we have the wire service acting and caching all the data. Isn't it great? Okay, so if you want to see the code of the talk, here you have it, okay? I recommend you the sample app gallery. There we have a couple of sample apps written in Lightning Web Components, especially interesting the LWC recipes one, which contains really simple examples of how to implement things in Lightning Web Components, and some content in Trailhead and the documentation, of course. And that's it. Any questions, please?
Hi, it's Rupert. Can you share your slides?
Yeah, I will share them. Sure.
Can we read platform events with LWC?
Well, what you can do is to use a component, which is the Lightning EMP connector, and that component provides you the reading capabilities to subscribe to a platform event. So that's possible, yes. And I think that's, we have that connector already in LWC. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So I would say Lightning message service is to communicate components that are in the same page, but if you want to communicate org-wide, then that would be the way to go.
What's the way to migrate from Aura to Lightning Web Components?
Mm-hmm. So my recommendation is that you think about it in a step-by-step approach, as we did today, because if you try to migrate everything at a time, it's probably that you don't get it working at the end. But if you first migrate one small component, try to use it. For example, you know that Lightning Web Components can be used inside an Aura component. So you can try to reference that component and see if everything is working. And then migrate another piece, and then migrate another piece. I try to do it that way, so that is not a nightmare. No. And also be aware of all the capabilities that Lightning Web Components have, all the services, because it's not. There is a lot of code that you will probably be able to remove. And same when you come from Visualforce, is the same. It's, well, even much more. Much more.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to question. You didn't mention design and documentation. Design to integrate the component in the app builder. You know, for default parameters.
Yeah, so that's something that you need to define in your metadata file. Remember that I told you that this is the way to define when the component is going to be available for the different Salesforce experiences, as for example, a builder, the utility bar, whatever. And there is where you defined also the properties that you want to surface in a builder. And there's a new capability as well regarding properties, because before properties were fixed for all targets. And now you can say, for example, if this component is used in an app page, I want it to have 2 properties exposed. But if it's used in a record page, I want it to have no properties exposed because I already have the record.
That's great.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so I think that, I'm not sure if the people from the event will share the slides, but if somebody wants them, just bring me your email or something and I will send them to you, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.